Losing everything changes you. It clears away the noise and leaves you with only what's real. But they don't tell you what happens when you start taking it all back. They don't tell you that's when the real damage begins. Modern Queen Tales presents I Am Redefined. Remember to like, subscribe, and above all, enjoy. Without further ado, let's give these pages a flip. Flames devoured the heavy parchment of my father's final will. The fire curled the edges of the thick ivory paper, blackening the embossed Walker Enterprises seal at the top before consuming the signature at the bottom. The scent of burning wax, aged paper, and lighter fluid filled the mahogany-paneled study. My older brother Kyle held the silver Zippo lighter, his thumb resting heavily on the flint wheel. Beside him, our sister Simone stood with the leather-bound folio tucked under her arm. A thin, satisfied smile curved her perfectly painted red lips. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, counting down the exact seconds marking the end of my life as I knew it. The 2022 addendum completely supersedes the original document, Maya, Simone stated. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sharp and metallic. Father transferred the controlling shares to the primary holding trust 48 hours before his stroke. Paragraph 4, subsection B explicitly excludes you from that specific trust. I stared at the black flakes curling in the center of the silver ashtray on my father's desk. Hours earlier, the relentless October rain had soaked through my black wool coat at his funeral. I had stood by the open grave, mourning the ruthless, brilliant man who built Walker Enterprises from a single rusted shipping warehouse in Brooklyn into a global real estate and logistics conglomerate. I had loved him. I had worked under him for a decade, learning the brutal mathematics of global trade. Now, I stood in his personal sanctuary, watching my own bloodline erase my existence. Kyle brushed a speck of gray soot from the lapel of his bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket. He snapped the Zippo shut with a sharp click. The legal maneuver possesses absolute, airtight integrity. We filed the secondary injunction at exactly 4:59 p.m. today, 1 minute before the clerk's office closed. The probate judge signed off on the emergency asset freeze an hour ago. You own absolutely nothing. Kyle and Simone had orchestrated a masterclass in legal butchery. My personal and corporate bank accounts rested entirely within the family office infrastructure. The freeze locked me out of every single dollar I possessed. The title to my penthouse in Tribeca had moved to a subsidiary shell company 3 weeks ago. They had buried the transfer deed in a massive stack of routine compliance documents my father signed while heavily sedated on morphine. They stripped my name, my access, and my legacy in a synchronized, lethal strike designed to leave me entirely paralyzed. Leave your master keycard on the desk, Kyle commanded. He pointed a manicured finger at the polished wood. Security deactivated your biometrics for the residential elevator at 11 o'clock. You have exactly 10 minutes to exit the property before I authorize the guards to physically remove you for criminal trespassing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy black plastic card. I placed it directly on the center of the desk, right beside the smoldering ashes of my inheritance. The silence in the room stretched tight, vibrating with their ugly anticipation. They craved tears. They desired a spectacular, weeping breakdown. They hungered for the deep satisfaction of my begging on my knees for a scrap of the family wealth. I turned on my heel and walked out the heavy oak door. The night air hit my face like a sheet of solid ice as I walked down the sweeping, mile-long driveway of the Connecticut estate. The massive wrought iron gates locked behind me with a heavy metallic clang. I pulled my phone from my pocket to call a car service. The screen displayed a harsh no services error in the top right corner. They had already terminated my cellular plan. I pulled my damp wool coat tighter around my shoulders, leaned into the freezing wind, and began the 3-mile walk to the local commuter train station. I spent the night in a $40 motel room in Queens. The lumpy mattress smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The neon vacancy sign outside my window flickered constantly, casting erratic, blood-red shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, staring at the crumpled bills in my hands. $32. I had exactly $32 in cash, pulled from the lining of my coat pocket. This represented absolute rock bottom. The thick, comfortable insulation of high society security vanished in the span of a single heartbeat, replaced entirely by the cold, unforgiving concrete of the real world. I closed my eyes and let the raw reality of my total destitution wash over my skin. The sharp, aching grief for my father burned away, replaced immediately by a cold, crystalline, terrifying focus. Kyle and Simone possessed my money. They controlled the buildings, the ships, and the massive bank accounts. They fundamentally misunderstood the true source of my power. They firmly believed the Walker Empire made me successful. They completely forgot I served as the actual architect running the daily operations while they attended charity galas and posed for magazine covers. I knew the exact shipping routes. I knew the profit margins. I knew where the rot lived inside the corporate structure. I needed capital. I needed a massive injection of liquidity immediately, and I needed to secure it entirely off the grid. Operating from the deep shadows became my new, permanent existence. The chaotic public library on 42nd Street served as my first corporate headquarters. I purchased a prepaid burner phone from a bodega with 20 of my remaining dollars. I sat at a scratched wooden table, using the library's unsecured, lagging Wi-Fi to reach out to the specific contacts Kyle and Simone deemed entirely beneath their notice. I called the disgraced ex-employees. I messaged the small-time vendors the Walker accounting department routinely stiffed. I emailed the aggressive international rivals my father had ruthlessly pushed out of the emerging Asian markets. I set my primary sights on Greg Summers. Greg operated as a highly reclusive venture capitalist based in Singapore. He harbored a massive, decades-old grudge against the Walker family stemming from a catastrophically botched merger in the late 90s. My father had publicly humiliated Greg, costing the man millions. I pitched him via a highly encrypted, secure video call from a rented, soundproof co-working booth in Brooklyn. I possess the complete internal schematics of Walker Enterprises' entire global supply chain, I told the blank computer screen. Greg strictly preferred audio-only communication to maintain his intense privacy. I know their massive inefficiencies. I know their critical structural vulnerabilities down to the exact dollar. I am currently building a decentralized, AI-driven logistics infrastructure. This system will render their legacy shipping models entirely obsolete within exactly 6 months. I require $10 million in immediate seed capital. In return for your investment, I will hand you the rotting, bankrupt corpse of my family's empire. The silence stretched across the Pacific Ocean, heavy and calculating. The digital connection crackled slightly. A dry, raspy voice finally replied, "Send the contract to my secure server." I built Phoenix Global at the breakneck, terrifying speed of a 2026 tech startup. I incorporated the business in Delaware through a complex blind trust, utilizing a completely synthesized corporate identity. I operated exclusively under the pseudonym M.V. Vanguard. I functioned as a ghost CEO, communicating with my growing staff only through encrypted text messages and highly paid legal proxies. We completely bypassed the traditional, expensive warehousing models my family relied upon. Phoenix Global utilized massive fleets of idle, automated delivery drones. We quietly leased excess, unused space in dark stores scattered across the entire eastern seaboard. We operated with zero bloated overhead. We undercut Walker Enterprises' primary freight division pricing by exactly 40%. We systematically stole their mid-level, reliable clients one by one, bleeding their revenue streams dry. The new profits rolled in, massive, swift, and entirely untraceable. I funneled the mounting revenue directly into a complex dark pool investment fund I established in the Cayman Islands. While I built a lethal new machine in the shadows, Kyle and Simone played the role of visionary CEOs in the blinding public light. They threw lavish, million-dollar parties on inherited yachts. They posed in designer clothing for major financial magazines. Meanwhile, their core legacy businesses bled massive amounts of cash. To cover their skyrocketing operating losses and maintain their obscene billionaire lifestyles, they began taking out massive, high-interest loans against the family's legacy commercial real estate portfolio. This debt became my ultimate target. I instructed my sophisticated financial proxies to directly approach the nervous, over-leveraged regional banks holding the newly issued Walker debt. My shadow corporation quietly purchased the distressed debt markers at a steep, desperate discount. The banks eagerly unloaded the risky loans to my anonymous fund. Within 8 months of my eviction into the cold Connecticut rain, I secretly became the single largest primary creditor of my own family. I owned the heavily leveraged paper on their Manhattan headquarters, their New Jersey shipping hubs, and their sprawling private residential estate. They bled from 1,000 invisible cuts. The time had arrived to apply the final tourniquet, twist the rod, and tighten the pressure until the limb completely fell off. Kyle and Simone possessed deep, consuming greed combined with profound, crippling paranoia. I designed my final infiltration strategy to perfectly exploit both fatal flaws. I required a human face for my trap. I deployed Derek McLaren. I hired Derek from a high-end corporate espionage firm. He operated as a highly paid corporate actor possessing a pristine, entirely fabricated resume. Derek acted as the smooth, wealthy public face of LeBlanc Capital, a newly minted subsidiary of my offshore dark pool. Derek approached Kyle directly at a high-profile leukemia charity gala in downtown Manhattan. He cornered my brother near the champagne fountain. Derek offered a magnificent, glowing lifeline, a massive, low-interest capital injection to modernize the failing infrastructure of Walker Enterprises. The loan required a simple, standard guarantee. Derek asked to secure the funds using the family's remaining unencumbered voting shares as collateral. The aggressive social engineering campaign commenced the very next morning. I hired a team of elite private investigators to feed carefully curated, highly damaging misinformation directly to Simone's ambitious executive assistant, a woman named Chloe. Chloe frequently leaked office gossip. My operatives slid fake dossiers into Chloe's gym bag. The fabricated rumors detailed Kyle's secret, late-night meetings with Derek McLaren. The forged documents strongly suggested Kyle planned to use the massive LeBlanc capital injection to execute a hostile, ruthless buyout of Simone's half of the entire company. Simultaneously, Derek played his designated role perfectly. He whispered toxic secrets to Kyle during their weekly high-stakes golf games in the Hamptons. He planted deep seeds of doubt regarding Simone's mental stability. He casually mentioned her reckless, highly publicized spending on failing, volatile cryptocurrency ventures. Derek hinted darkly that Simone actively prepared to sell her remaining shares to a massive Chinese rival conglomerate simply to cover her spiraling personal debts. The pressure cooker hissed, building lethal steam. The siblings completely stopped communicating. They changed the locks on their respective executive office doors. They hired separate, heavily armed private security teams to aggressively monitor each other's daily movements. The manufactured paranoia fractured their executive judgment completely. Desperate to secure the LeBlanc funds before the other sibling could strike the final blow, Kyle and Simone demanded separate, highly clandestine meetings with Derek McLaren. They sought to finalize the massive capital injection independently. They sat in identical, sterile glass conference rooms at the LeBlanc Capital offices on Wall Street, separated by exactly 3 days. They arrogantly signed hundreds of pages of incredibly complex financial agreements. They completely ignored the dense legal addendums. Their blinding greed and sheer desperation blinded them to the microscopic print deliberately buried deep in subsection 42, paragraph C. They unknowingly signed a master proxy agreement. They legally transferred the total, irrevocable voting rights of the Walker Family Trust directly to my anonymous shell corporation as collateral. The proxy legally activated the exact moment the primary loan entered a state of default. The steel trap set perfectly. The jagged jaws locked wide open, waiting for the trigger. The annual Walker Enterprises shareholder meeting took place on a crisp, bright Tuesday in late October. The cloudless autumn sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom perfectly matched the slate-gray, expensive suits of the nervous, murmuring board members. Kyle stood rigidly at the head of the long teak table. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead under the harsh glare of the recessed LED lighting. Simone sat immediately to his right. She obsessively tapped a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen against the cover of her leather portfolio. The global financial markets had opened that morning in a brutal, unprecedented freefall. A sudden, catastrophic crash in the Asian tech equities sector triggered a massive, spreading liquidity crisis across all major Western exchanges. I had fully anticipated this exact market correction for 6 weeks. I had analyzed the incoming global market data through Phoenix Global's highly advanced predictive algorithms. I sat comfortably in the back seat of an unmarked black Lincoln Town car parked directly across the street from the towering Walker Tower. My sleek silver laptop rested heavily on my knees. A secure, encrypted cable connected my machine directly to the internal financial servers of LeBlanc Capital. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the Walker Enterprises stock price plummeted drastically. The ticker symbol dropped straight through the floor, falling violently beneath the critical financial threshold explicitly specified in their LeBlanc loan covenants. I firmly pressed the enter key. The automated margin calls triggered simultaneously. The ruthless digital systems at LeBlanc Capital immediately demanded the total, instantaneous repayment of the $200 million loan Kyle and Simone had greedily consumed. The Walker corporate accounts, entirely drained by their months of gross mismanagement and lavish spending, registered absolute zero available liquidity. The massive financial default hit the servers as instantaneous and irrevocable. I closed my laptop. I stepped out of the warm town car and walked purposefully across the busy street. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the massive skyscraper that bore my last name in towering steel letters. The lobby security guards tipped their hats respectfully as I approached. These guards worked directly for a private third-party firm I had quietly, systematically acquired the month prior. I bypassed the main security desk completely. I swiped my newly minted master access card and entered the private executive elevator. Upstairs on the 60th floor, the heavy mahogany boardroom doors flew open with a violent crash. Kyle stopped speaking mid-sentence. His red laser pointer dropped from his shaking hand and clattered loudly onto the polished teak table. Simone gasped sharply. Her heavy leather chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor as she stood up in sudden shock. The 20 older board members turned around in their seats, murmuring in deep confusion as I confidently crossed the threshold into the room. I wore a sharply tailored, immaculate crimson suit. I chose the exact, vivid color of fresh, spilling blood. "Security!" Kyle shouted. His voice cracked loudly with raw, unfiltered panic. "How did you get in this building? Get her out of here immediately!" The two heavily armed security contractors flanking the interior of the boardroom doors remained perfectly, solidly still. They crossed their hands in front of their belts, staring straight ahead. I walked slowly and deliberately to the opposite end of the long table. I placed a massive, thick stack of heavy manila folders down on the polished wood with a loud smack. "The security team works exclusively for Phoenix Global, Kyle. Phoenix Global wholly owns LeBlanc Capital. LeBlanc Capital entirely owns your massive, crippling debt." The blood completely drained from Simone's face. Her skin turned a sickly, chalky white. Her eyes grew incredibly hollow. "LeBlanc, Derek McLaren, you ran LeBlanc." "I run LeBlanc," I confirmed coldly. I slid the thick master default notices straight down the center of the smooth table. The papers fanned out perfectly. "You officially defaulted on your massive margin calls precisely 4 minutes ago. According to the strict terms of the Horizon Agreement you both so eagerly signed last month, total and absolute voting control of the Walker Family Trust defaults instantly to the primary creditor in the event of total insolvency." I looked directly into the faces of the terrified board members. Kyle and Simone Walker are hereby permanently removed from their executive positions as CEO and COO, effective this exact second. Their physical access to this building, their digital access to all company bank accounts, and their legal rights to all subsidiary assets are entirely revoked. "You absolutely cannot do this!" Kyle roared. He slammed both his fists violently onto the table. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. "This constitutes an illegal hostile takeover. This maneuver breaks federal law." "My maneuver remains entirely perfectly legal, Kyle," I stated. My voice held completely steady, ringing cold and sharp in the cavernous room. "I will tell you exactly what constitutes a massive illegal act. Wire fraud breaks the law. When you and Simone secured the $200 million loan from LeBlanc, you legally pledged the entire Walker commercial real estate portfolio as your primary collateral. You completely failed to disclose that you had already leveraged those exact same properties to 3 different, highly secretive offshore banks to desperately cover your massive personal trading losses. I tapped a single manicured fingernail aggressively against the top manila folder. You deliberately falsified federal loan documents. You committed a massive, undeniable Class B felony. The high, piercing wail of police sirens echoed clearly from the busy Manhattan street below. The sound grew rapidly louder as multiple cruisers pulled aggressively up to the main entrance of the towering skyscraper. Kyle collapsed completely into his chair. All the artificial strength vanished from his spine. He buried his sweating face deep in his shaking hands. Simone simply stared at me. Her eyes stretched wide with a terror so profound and absolute it completely paralyzed her vocal cords. They had spent their entire lives firmly believing they remained untouchable. They hid behind the thick shield of a legacy name they had done absolutely nothing to build. Now, the massive, crushing weight of their own blind arrogance drove them straight into the floorboards. The boardroom doors opened wide a second time. 6 stern federal agents wearing dark FBI windbreakers stepped aggressively into the quiet room. Their gold badges flashed brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Kyle Walker. Simone Walker," the lead federal agent announced loudly. He pulled a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his black leather belt. "You are officially under arrest for massive conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal bank fraud." I watched in total, absolute silence as the armed agents physically pulled my older brother and sister from their plush, expensive leather chairs. They offered zero resistance. They failed to fight. They completely forgot to scream for their lawyers. The absolute crushing totality of their massive defeat left them as empty, hollow shells. As the agents marched them roughly out of the grand room, Kyle looked back over his shoulder one final time, his bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. He desperately searched my face for a tiny trace of familial pity. He looked for a single, lingering shred of the little sister he had callously discarded in the freezing rain 1 year ago. He found absolutely nothing but cold, polished, impenetrable glass. 6 months later, I stood quietly by the massive window of my new penthouse office on the 60th floor. Outside, a highly skilled crew of industrial ironworkers hung suspended securely from heavy steel cables. They methodically, efficiently unbolted the massive steel W from the highest facade of the skyscraper. The bright, burning sparks from their heavy blowtorches fell like heavy golden rain against the clear morning sky. I watched the massive metal letter swing completely away from the glass. The crane operator lowered the heavy steel W slowly toward the large flatbed trucks waiting patiently on the busy street far below. By noon, the crew would firmly install the new signage. The Phoenix Building. My new executive assistant, a razor-sharp, fiercely intelligent young woman named Angela, I had ruthlessly poached from a massive rival tech firm, stepped quietly into the office. "Ms. Walker, the complete liquidation of the Connecticut estate finished 10 minutes ago. The final funds transferred successfully into the Phoenix Global Primary Expansion account." "Thank you, Angela," I replied smoothly. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the window and the falling sparks. "Send the final architectural blueprints for the new automated logistics hub directly to my tablet." The massive psychological shift over the past brutal year had fundamentally, permanently rewired my brain. The intense, burning desire for revenge, the fiery, all-consuming need to destroy the exact people who had wronged me had burned itself completely out. The fire consumed the fuel and died. In its place stood a cold, unshakable, magnificent architecture of absolute market dominance. I no longer cared the slightest bit about Kyle and Simone. They currently sat in separate, tiny cells in a federal detention center awaiting a massive criminal trial they would certainly lose. They existed only as faded ghosts. They represented weak remnants of a past life that held absolutely zero power over my current reality. Inherited wealth acted as a lethal poison in the blood. It bred pathetic weakness. It fostered blind entitlement. It created the fatal, arrogant delusion that absolute power represented a permanent birthright rather than a daily, bloody conquest. The massive empire my father built remained incredibly fragile because it relied entirely on the lazy assumption of continuous safety. The new empire I built strictly from the blackened ashes of my own total destruction remained invincible. Every single brick, every complex algorithm, every ruthless corporate acquisition belonged entirely to me. I knew the exact heavy weight of every single stone in the foundation because I had personally carried them all upon my own back from the absolute, freezing bottom of the world. I placed my palm flat against the cold, thick glass of the window. I looked out over the sprawling, endlessly moving grid of the city. The financial markets were opening. The digital bells rang across the globe. The brutal game was beginning once again. And this time, I owned the entire board. The end.
If you enjoyed this quick escape, hit the subscribe button for new stories twice a week. Until then, I'll see you at the next flip of the pages.